In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte marched into Moscow with the greatest army ever assembled in human history. He found an empty city. Then it caught fire. Then he left. And somehow, depending on who you ask, he won. This is that story. Let's back up. By 1812, Napoleon had conquered basically everything worth conquering in Europe. France controlled more territory than any European power since the Roman Empire. Napoleon had beaten Austria, beaten Prussia, beaten pretty much everyone who had the nerve to show up. There was one problem: Russia. Russia had signed a treaty with Napoleon in 1807, the Treaty of Tilsit, which was supposed to make them allies, or at least not enemies. Russia agreed to stop trading with Britain, which was Napoleon's main rival and the one country he genuinely could not beat. Russia then proceeded to keep trading with Britain, because Russia is enormous and does what it wants. Napoleon, who did not handle being ignored particularly well, decided to solve this problem in the most reasonable way possible. He would invade Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Grande Armée, 600,000 men, from France, from Poland, from Italy, from basically every country Napoleon had already conquered and was now drafting soldiers from. The largest military force ever assembled on the European continent. Napoleon's plan was simple: march into Russia, fight a massive decisive battle, win, force Russia to surrender, go home. It was a very good plan for fighting a normal country. Russia is not a normal country. The Russian army, commanded by General Kutuzov, who was old, overweight, possibly half-blind, and genuinely one of the best military minds of his era, looked at Napoleon's 600,000 men and made a decision. Don't fight them. Just retreat. Every time Napoleon advanced, the Russians pulled back. Every time Napoleon tried to force a decisive battle, the Russians disappeared deeper into their own territory. They burned crops as they retreated. They destroyed supplies. They left nothing for the French army to live off. Napoleon kept advancing because that's what Napoleon did. He was not a man who turned around. The French army marched through the summer, then into autumn, hundreds of miles into Russian territory, losing men not to battles but to exhaustion, disease, and the sheer impossibility of supplying 600,000 soldiers across an enormous hostile country. By the time they reached Moscow in September, Napoleon had already lost a third of his army. And then they fought the Battle of Borodino. Borodino is one of the bloodiest single days in military history. 70,000 casualties in one day. Both sides threw everything they had at each other for hours. At the end of it, neither side had clearly won. But the Russians retreated again, which meant Napoleon could march into Moscow, which he did. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte rode into Moscow. The city was empty. The Russian governor had ordered the evacuation of Moscow's entire civilian population. Every person, every government official, every supply of food and equipment that could be moved. And then, as Napoleon's army settled in for what they assumed would be a comfortable winter, Moscow caught fire. Not by accident. The Russians burned it themselves. The governor had left behind agents with instructions to set fire to the city rather than let the French use it. Within days, 3/4 of Moscow was gone. The food, the shelter, the supplies Napoleon had been counting on to sustain his army through winter, all of it ash. Napoleon sat in the ruins of the Kremlin and waited for Russia to surrender. Russia did not surrender. He sent peace proposals, multiple times. Tsar Alexander I ignored every single one of them. Alexander had made a decision. He would not negotiate with Napoleon while a single French soldier stood on Russian soil. Not one negotiation, not one letter back. Napoleon waited. October came. The temperature dropped. He waited some more. November came. Napoleon finally accepted what should have been obvious months earlier. Russia was not going to surrender. His army was sitting in a burned city with no food, no shelter, and a Russian winter arriving on schedule. He ordered the retreat, and here is where the story becomes genuinely catastrophic. The retreat from Moscow is one of the greatest military disasters in history. The Russian winter arrived in full force. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. The French army, already weakened and undersupplied, began dying in enormous numbers. The Russians harassed them the entire way back. Not in pitched battles, just constant pressure. Cossack cavalry attacking supply lines, cutting off stragglers, making every mile of retreat cost lives. Of the 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, approximately 100,000 made it back. 100,000 out of 600,000. Napoleon lost 500,000 men in Russia, the greatest army in European history, destroyed not by defeat in battle but by the oldest enemies in warfare: distance, cold, and hunger. And yet, here is the argument that Napoleon won. He took Moscow, the ancient capital of Russia, the symbolic heart of the Russian Empire. He sat in the Kremlin. He controlled the city, however, briefly, however burned it was. More importantly, the campaign broke both sides. Russia lost enormous numbers of soldiers too. The Russian army that emerged from 1812 was not the same army that went in. Russia had burned its own capital city to stop him. You don't burn your own capital city for someone you've defeated. You burn it because you're terrified of them. Napoleon didn't lose the War of 1812 because Russia defeated him in battle. He was never defeated in battle in Russia. Not once. He lost because Russia refused to play by the rules, refused to have the decisive battle that would end the war, refused to surrender when their capital fell, refused to negotiate. Russia didn't beat Napoleon. Russia just waited him out. And if you define winning as defeating your enemy in battle, Napoleon never lost. He just ran out of time, and soldiers, and food, and warmth. But other than that, total victory. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He burned Moscow. And if you ask him, he won.